On this week's episode, we discuss the formative years of a young Boston player who operated on the streets of 1940s Roxbury and Harlem. He went by the street name of Detroit Red, but you and I know him as Malcolm X. Welcome back, everyone. Today I have an incredible story, one that I've wanted to present since starting this channel. I wasn't sure how interested people would be or how well it would be received, so I hesitated. But after the tremendous response I've gotten from the video about Black Boston, I think it's safe to say that there's a large audience interested in this topic. Again, thank you to everyone that supported that video. I'm truly blown away. The story that I'm bringing you today is not only relevant because it's a great piece of Boston lore. A young player from the Roxbury streets nicknamed Detroit Red would go on to become one of the most important people in the 20th century. But also, more importantly, Malcolm's journey can give hope to countless people, young and old. His story reinforces the notion that you can never count anyone out. Most importantly, yourself. To say that Malcolm's early life was tumultuous would be the understatement of the century. The man that we know as Malcolm X was born Malcolm Little on May 19, 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska. He was the fourth of 7 children to Earl Little and Louise Little. Earl was a Baptist minister from Georgia and a follower of Marcus Garvey's Black nationalism movement and served as the Omaha chapter president. Malcolm's mother Louise was an educated woman from the West Indian island of Grenada and served as the division secretary. After Earl ran afoul with local whites for riling up the local blacks with his fiery sermons, the family was chased out of Omaha and relocated briefly to Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1926, only to relocate 2 years later in 1928 to Lansing, Michigan. Earl Little could be hard on his wife and children at times. There was always an element of friction between Earl and Louise, who were very culturally different. Earl was from the deep south in Georgia and loved pork and other soul food, while Louise, who was from the West Indies, refused to eat or prepare pork and other staples of Earl's diet, which upset him. It would seem that no matter where the Littles moved, Earl's preaching and unwillingness to stand down caused problems with the local white population. But in no place were the consequences as dire as when the family moved to Lansing, Michigan. Soon after the family moved to Lansing, they were sued for eviction. Apparently there was a bylaw, whether unbeknownst to Earl or not, that blacks could not buy property in certain sections of Lansing. Earl refused to move his family amid rising tensions with neighbors. Then on the night of November 7, 1928, a white group called the Black Legionnaires set fire to the Little house. The whole family, including all 7 children, sat outside in the freezing cold, watching their house burned. As neighbors watched and did nothing, no fire brigade came to battle the flames. In December of that year, Malcolm's father, Earl, moved the family to a farmhouse in East Lansing, which was advantageous to the family because they were able to raise chickens and grow vegetables. They lived there for several years in what on the surface seemed like relative peace, but Earl's situation with local whites was not improving. Usually Garvey's Pan-African movement, which promotes blacks in America to relocate to Africa, pleased these hate groups, but the fiery sermons that Earl gave and his willingness to stand up to these hate mongers made him a target. On September 28, 1931, Louise Little, who claimed to have some sort of extrasensory perception, which Malcolm himself claimed to also have, had a terrible premonition and begged her husband Earl not to leave the house. He did not heed her warnings and later that night was killed in what the authorities would deem a streetcar accident. But everyone in the Little family knew the truth. Earl Little was murdered for his refusal to accept the status quo. Because the death was deemed accidental, Earl's large life insurance policy would not pay out, and the family only received a smaller payout. This crushed Louise. She knew her husband had been murdered, and there was no way for the family to seek justice or compensation. After having trouble securing work and struggling to support the family financially, Louise sank into a deep depression. She began to lose control of her 7 children, and Malcolm was arrested for shoplifting. He was stealing food out of necessity. Social services began snooping around the little house, and instead of helping the family out, they just criticized Louise. As a proud woman, Louise did not appreciate this and was naturally defensive. Eventually, social services deemed that Louise could no longer support or take care of her children, and they split the family up, parceling off the children all the different foster homes. Louise, who is already suffering from depression, would eventually have a full-fledged mental breakdown on December 23, 1938, and she was sent to the terribly depressing Michigan State Hospital in Kalamazoo, where she would stay for the next 26 years. This would be heartbreaking to a young Malcolm. After living in several foster homes, Malcolm is kicked out of the 7th grade and he ends up being sent to a juvenile home run by a family named the Swerlins in the nearly all-white town of Mason, Michigan. Malcolm is the only black child in the house and also in his new school. His case is overseen by a welfare caseworker named Mr. Allen. Malcolm states that he wasn't mistreated while living with the Swerlins, but it felt almost like a mascot or something akin to a pet. He said people would talk about him like he wasn't even there. While attending school in Mason, Malcolm did very well academically and was voted the class president. He shares with his teacher, Mr. Ostrowski, that he wants to become a lawyer when he grows up, to which the teacher replies that this isn't a reasonable expectation for a black person. He tries to persuade Malcolm to become a carpenter instead. This perplexed Malcolm, who knew that he was one of the smartest students in the school. At the time, it was very hurtful to young Malcolm and it damaged his self-esteem, but he would use this experience later in life to help him stubbornly reject American society's unbalanced status quo. In the summer of 1940, a 15-year-old Malcolm, with permission from Mr. Allen and the Swerlins, visits his half-sister Ella Little Collins in the Roxbury neighborhood of Boston. Ella had already previously established herself and was living a respectable middle-class life in Boston. When the young Malcolm first enters the Roxbury neighborhood, it instantly changes his life. He says, quote, "I could not have feigned indifference if I wanted to. I never knew the world contained as many black people as I saw thronging downtown Roxbury at night." Going from the almost all-white Mason, Michigan to the 1940s Roxbury, where everyone else looked like him, was certainly a life-altering experience. He instantly wanted nothing but to be in Roxbury and abandon his previous life in Michigan. After returning briefly to live with the Swerlins, Ella Collins petitions the welfare caseworker, Mr. Allen, for full custody of Malcolm, and in 1941 the state of Michigan grants it. For the first time in Malcolm's young life, fortune would seem to be in his favor, and he is able to move in with his stable blood-related sister and once again have a notion of family. He also is now able to reside in one of the fastest growing black neighborhoods in the United States, and the young Malcolm soaks up the culture. Malcolm's sister Ella was a respectable, upstanding citizen, and it was understood that if he was to live at Ella's house, he would need to be gainfully employed. Malcolm worked a few odd jobs at restaurants, bars, even in a jewelry store. But it was when Malcolm began shining shoes at the Roseland Ballroom that he met his best friend up until that point, Malcolm Shorty Jarvis. The two struck up a friendship and referred to each other as Homeboy. I read somewhere that Malcolm called Shorty Homeboy because he was from Lansing as well. I thought this would be quite the coincidence, but it's not true. Shorty was from Boston. The two just became close very quickly. Malcolm, of course, liked getting paid, but more importantly, Malcolm loved the scene around the Roseland Ballroom. Malcolm and Shorty would go to dances and shows there and at other venues across Roxbury. The two became very ingratiated into the swing scene, wearing loud zoot suits with wallet chains, a wide-brimmed hat topped with colorful feathers. It was at this time that Malcolm became introduced to a man named Freddie, who Malcolm claims taught him everything about the street and how to hustle. It was also at this time that Malcolm and Shorty gave each other conks, which was a hairstyle that black men wore to make their hair appear straight and more white. They applied this lye-based product into their hair, but the process was very painful. Malcolm claims that this was his first real step towards degradation. Shorty and Malcolm loved the swing scene and were becoming what people at the time referred to as hipsters. Malcolm began to make connections with people at the clubs and in bands, which helped him get into the world of dealing. Mary Jane was big on the jazz/swing music scene. The musicians loved it as well as the people that came to listen to the music. This gave Malcolm a sense of prestige. People were getting to know him, and he was becoming popular due to the service that he performed. It was around this time that he began to go by the name Detroit Red due to his trademark reddish hair. It was also during this time that Malcolm began dating a black girl named Laura from a nice middle-class neighborhood in Roxbury. But when a striking white woman named Sophia approached Malcolm at a club, he tossed Laura to the side in favor of the more promiscuous Sophia. In 1943, with World War II in full effect, an 18-year-old Malcolm responds to the draft. At this point in his life, Malcolm is having a lot of fun in the Roxbury nightlife scene, going to clubs and dancing. Everyone knows him because he's peddling Mary Jane. He's in with all the band members and the hipsters that go to the clubs. Also, being a teenage black man dating an older white woman who had her own car and would drive Malcolm around everywhere gave him a certain sense of prestige. So naturally, Malcolm had absolutely no intention on leaving this life for the jungles of the Pacific or the frozen Ardennes forest of Europe. Being above average intelligence, Malcolm knew a surefire way to dodge the draft. He walked into the office announcing loudly that he was crazy like his mama and he wanted to fight for the Japanese and kill white people. Naturally, he was deemed mentally unfit for service, and I'm surprised they didn't lock him up. But either way, Malcolm had achieved the result he desired. Malcolm's new lifestyle was concerning his sister Ella, who was a respectable woman, and she most certainly wanted to get Malcolm away from Sophia, who she saw as a terrible influence. So Ella used some of her connections and got Malcolm a job on the railways as a porter. Back in the day, they would serve coffee and food on long train rides, and that was Malcolm's job. Getting Malcolm the job on the train did not have the intended result that Ella wanted. One of the main routes that Malcolm worked on went through New York City, and this is how Malcolm was first introduced to Harlem. Going to Roxbury for the first time was a life-changing event, but when Malcolm first experienced Harlem, it was nothing like he had ever seen before. In the 1940s, Harlem was the center of Black America and Black American culture. It was the tail end of the Harlem Renaissance, which started in the 1920s. There were endless clubs with jazz and swing music playing. Black men and women dressed impeccably walked the streets. As he wanted earlier nothing more than to be in Roxbury, now the only place he wanted to be was Harlem. Using his connections that he made in Boston and with his job on the train, Malcolm began to smuggle Mary Jane back and forth, selling it to musicians and club patrons. He still dated Sophia, and even in the much larger Harlem, this still gave him a certain amount of prestige. It was around this time that Malcolm began hanging around at the famous Small's Paradise Club, and he met a notorious Harlem hustler named Sammy, who introduced him to all the players in the Harlem underworld. Malcolm would end up losing his job on the railroad, which at this point mattered little to him. Then in 1944, Malcolm had his first run-in with the law and was sentenced to 4 months in jail for larceny. All of this naturally made Ella very disappointed. This was not the life that she had envisioned for Malcolm when she took him in. But he was his own man who made his own decisions. After serving his 4-month sentence, Malcolm became known to authorities in Boston and couldn't make his trips back and forth supplying Mary Jane anymore. It was at this point that he moved to Harlem full-time and began hustling with Sammy and also working at Small's Paradise. Small's was a place where everyone from the underworld would meet, and Malcolm made countless connections there. When he was in Harlem, he would run into the girl Laura that he used to date in Roxbury. After he rejected her for Sophia, she dated someone who got her involved in narcotics. She eventually got strung out and was walking the streets, and Malcolm felt awful about this. While in Harlem, Malcolm did a little bit of everything, even working at a brothel. It was during this time period that Malcolm began dabbling with the Peruvian marching powder. He said it helped him to go out and commit crimes. He didn't care about anything when he took it. Malcolm always carried a blade on him, and he was developing a rep on the streets as someone not to be trifled with. It was through Sammy that Malcolm met notorious numbers kingpin West Indian Archie. The numbers, which is now the legal lottery that people play daily and the government makes a killing on, was a big deal in Harlem. It was a cultural thing. The lowliest resident of Harlem all the way up to the richest and most prominent citizens played daily. The number was always the last 3 digits of the daily total U.S. and domestic foreign sales, which was printed daily in the newspaper. So people would play their 3-digit number and the payout was 600 to 1. So if you put in 50 cents, you'd win $300. The numbers changed a lot of family fortunes in Harlem. Some people were able to buy houses or businesses with the earnings from the numbers. It also was a sense of pride in Harlem because the numbers game was always run by black people in Harlem. In the 1930s, when notorious racketeer Dutch Schultz tried to push in and take over the Harlem numbers, Stephanie St. Clair, the queen of the numbers, fought Dutch tooth and nail, not giving him an inch. When Dutch was taken out eventually by Lucky Luciano and the commission, St. Clair sent a card to him on his deathbed saying, "As ye sow, ye shall reap." Malcolm started to run numbers for West Indian Archie exclusively. It was Archie who gave Malcolm his first piece. West Indian Archie was a legend in Harlem, and legend has it that he never wrote a number down. He kept it all in his head. He figured writing the numbers down was just evidence for the authorities. Archie really liked the young Malcolm and was making it a point to school him in the game. But Malcolm was on a downward spiral. He was using heavily, gambling, and acting in just a generally reckless nature, which goes hand in hand with active addiction. He claimed to Archie that he hit the number for $600. Archie claimed that Malcolm made no such bet, and an argument ensued where Malcolm insisted that he placed a $1 wager and hit the number. West Indian Archie threw the money at him after Malcolm said he was slipping. Malcolm tried to give him back the money, but the damage was done. After Archie went back and checked the ledger, he realized that Malcolm was in fact lying. He never placed the bet. West Indian Archie, along with several henchmen, cornered Malcolm in a club with the intent to kill him. Malcolm managed to escape, but he had to flee Harlem, only to return later, but as a much different man. Sophia called Malcolm's friend Shorty Jarvis, and he drove down to Harlem and rescued Malcolm. When Malcolm, aka Detroit Red, arrived back in Boston in 1945, he was much different than before he had moved to Harlem. He seemed not to care about anything, and his self-destructive nature was running at full speed. Shorty noticed the difference in his friend as well. Malcolm was also using daily at this point. Malcolm had a plan to rob the city blind. He wanted to break into wealthy people's homes around the Boston area and fence the stolen goods. Along with Shorty, Sophia, and Sophia's youngest sister, they hooked up with a guy named Rudy, who through his catering jobs had inside information of some good spots to hit. An argument ensued over who would be in charge of the group, where Malcolm challenged Rudy to a game of Russian roulette. Malcolm later claimed to Shorty that there wasn't really anything in the chamber, but it had its intended effect. Nobody wanted to challenge Red because they all thought he was crazy. Malcolm even admits at this time period he felt more like an animal than a human. He didn't care whether he lived or died, and human life had no value to him. This was the climax of his life of self-hatred and degradation, and he would reflect later in life that he needed to reach these depths of depravity in order to complete his journey of redemption. The crew staged numerous burglaries around the Boston area and were holed up at a safe house right near Harvard Square in Cambridge. Later in life, when Malcolm would give a speech at Harvard, he talked about the fact that he was robbing and stealing while living a block away from the university. The crew was very brazen and not particularly careful. It was only a matter of time before they were going to get caught, especially with Malcolm already being known to Boston authorities. Finally, in January of 1946, Malcolm dropped off a watch from one of their burglaries at a watch shop to be fixed. The shop owner was suspicious of Malcolm and alerted the authorities. When Malcolm goes to pick up the watch, the police are there to arrest him. Malcolm ends up implicating everyone else, and Shorty, Sophia, and her sister are all arrested. The authorities offer Sophia and her sister a way out. If they say that their relationship was not consensual, they would get off scot-free, but they refuse. Sophia ends up going to Framingham's women's prison for 7 months, and her youngest sister gets a suspended sentence because she had no record. Malcolm and Shorty get multiple 8 to 10 year sentences, all to run concurrently. Shorty almost fainted, not realizing that concurrent meant that they would all run at the same time. He thought they had just been sentenced to almost 100 years. Malcolm would say later that it felt like they were more on trial for dating white women than the actual burglaries. In February of 1946, the 20-year-old Malcolm Little was assigned inmate number 22843 and began his 8 to 10 year sentence at the medieval-style dungeon that was the Charlestown prison. Malcolm obviously had a tough time adjusting. The living conditions were horrendous and the guards were racist and brutal. Luckily, the next year in 1947, Malcolm got transferred to the Concord Reformatory, which was still miserable but better than Charlestown. It was in Concord that Malcolm met a man called Bimby. Bimby was the first black man that Malcolm had met that could control people solely with his words. He did not need to use force to have people fear or respect him. He simply used his superior intellect and oratory skills to demand respect amongst guards and prisoners alike. Bimby saw the potential in a young Malcolm and encouraged him to read and study to better himself. Malcolm took Bimby's advice and began reading voraciously, soaking up knowledge wherever he could. It's the old adage, they can lock up your body, but not your mind. In 1948, Malcolm would be transferred to Norfolk State Prison. By this point, 4 of Malcolm's 7 siblings had converted to Islam and were encouraging Malcolm to do the same. He initially was resistant, but when his brother Reginald told him that if he stopped smoking and eating pork, he could get out of prison faster, obviously that grabbed Malcolm's attention. While in Norfolk, he would attend chapel and would argue with the chaplain about scripture, to which the chaplain started referring to Malcolm as Satan. Malcolm also joined a debate team, and he was getting recognition for his incredible oratory skills. This was one of the first times that Malcolm was getting attention for something positive, and it was the reinforcement that he needed. It was also during this period that Malcolm started to correspond with Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam. Elijah was also in prison for sedition and violation of U.S. draft laws. Prison was the biggest recruiting ground for the Nation of Islam at the time. After corresponding with Elijah, Malcolm converts to Islam. He eventually petitions the Massachusetts governor and demands his right to practice his religion in prison. Malcolm emerges from prison a completely changed man. After being denied parole in 1951, Malcolm is eventually granted parole on August 7, 1952. After spending only one night at his sister Ella's house in Roxbury, Malcolm moves to Detroit to live with his brother Wilfred, a practicing Muslim. Malcolm joins the Nation of Islam and attends Temple No. 1 in Detroit, only one of 4 temples in the country at the time. It was at this point that Malcolm rejects the name Little that he sees as a slave's name and takes the name Malcolm X. He's dismayed about the low turnout in the temple at this point. The Nation of Islam only had around 400 members nationally. With Elijah Muhammad's blessing, Malcolm would go on an intense recruiting campaign and membership would explode. By August 1953, Detroit's temple membership had tripled and Malcolm is appointed assistant minister there. In September, Elijah sends Malcolm back to Roxbury to serve as head minister as Temple No. 11. Malcolm would go on to start temples up and down the East Coast, from Philadelphia to Hartford, Connecticut. Malcolm would meet his future wife, Betty X, in Harlem, and famously later proposes over the phone from a payphone in Detroit. After they were married, Malcolm is appointed first minister of Temple No. 7 in Harlem. It's his highest achievement up until this point. By the late 1950s, Malcolm's life had come full circle. He had returned to Harlem a completely different man. No longer was he a criminal living in degradation and self-hatred. He was now a righteous man and one of the most respected ministers in the country. He and his wife Betty lived with their growing family in Elmhurst, Queens, a respectable middle-class neighborhood. Malcolm was the head minister at the largest temple in the country. He was being recognized nationally and was asked to speak at colleges and on television. He had an undying loyalty towards Elijah Muhammad and Islam because they saved his life in Malcolm's opinion. But unfortunately, all this success made Malcolm enemies. Other brothers in the Nation of Islam grew very jealous of Malcolm's fame and success. Even Elijah Muhammad was getting nervous of Malcolm's growing power. Originally, Malcolm was supposed to be the man to lead the nation after Elijah passed, but Elijah Muhammad had changed his mind. They began to discredit Malcolm and try to silence him. Eventually, after finding out about Elijah Muhammad's falsehoods and his adulterous ways, Malcolm split off from the nation and started his own movement. Initially, while with the Nation of Islam, Malcolm harbored a deep resentment towards whites and spoke harshly against them. He also had no interest in working with other civil rights leaders that were open to working with whites. But after Malcolm left the nation and made his pilgrimage to Mecca, his viewpoints changed. Hajj is a pilgrimage that all Muslim adults are supposed to make at least once in their life if possible. The holy city of Mecca in Saudi Arabia, which is the direction that all Muslims face in their daily prayers, is where Hajj takes place. It's a 5 to 6 day event that usually takes place sometime in June or July. It culminates in hundreds of thousands to millions of Muslims congregating at Kaaba, or the House of Allah. Hajj is considered one of the 5 pillars of Islam. When Malcolm attended, he realized that there were Muslims of all colors from every corner of the world. There are a huge number of Eastern European Muslims from the conquest of the Ottoman Turks. In order for Malcolm to perform Hajj, he had to accept them as his brothers and break bread with them. It was an eye-opening experience for Malcolm. He realized that Islam wasn't just a religion for black people, but humanity as a whole. When he returned from Hajj, his mind was much more open and he began talking and working with people who he wouldn't have dealt with in the past. He even spoke to Martin Luther King before his passing, which is someone who he detested previously. Unfortunately, though, this was otherwise a dark time for Malcolm and his family. After speaking out against Elijah Muhammad and the nation, Malcolm's house was being vandalized and they were receiving threatening calls at all hours. Eventually, their house in Queens was burnt down, most likely by the Nation of Islam. Also, the CIA and FBI were following Malcolm and harassing him. They were not keen on such a powerful and intelligent black man who was not afraid of the establishment. After having a premonition just like his mother did the day that his father died, Malcolm would go on to give a speech at the Audubon Ballroom on February 21, 1965. His friends told him to postpone the speech, but unfortunately Malcolm realized that it was his fate to become a martyr. In front of a large crowd, Malcolm was assassinated while giving his speech. The killing was most likely ordered by his enemies in the Nation of Islam. Malcolm X, in my opinion, is one of the most important people, not just of the Civil Rights era, but in all of American history. His journey through childhood trauma, foster care, addiction and prison, only to come out on the other side as one of the most influential and important people in American society. It's a message of hope, perseverance, and faith that can benefit all people. It's upsetting to me that we barely learned anything about Malcolm X in school. When they talked about black leaders, it was mostly Martin Luther King. Not to discredit Dr. King, but Malcolm's story is much more powerful and resonates in people's soul. I can personally remember the profound experience it was to watch Spike Lee's movie as a young adult. By the age of 20, I was already in and out of jail multiple times. Seeing Malcolm's story and his road to redemption gave me hope that I too could be redeemed. Malcolm X was a gift to all humankind, and his messages are just as relevant now as they were before. Never accept injustice towards yourself or anyone else. Always seek the truth and stay true to your own heart. No one in our society is a throwaway. Not a child in the foster care system, not a homeless person, not an addict, not a convict. We are all redeemable. We all have a purpose if we just let God show us the way. Malcolm X is truly one of my heroes for never giving up, never backing down, and always fighting for what he believed in. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. It's an incredibly powerful story, and it's such an important piece of history that should not be forgotten. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button, subscribe if you're not already subscribed, leave me a comment. Thank you again, everybody, for your tremendous support in that video I released a couple weeks ago. Welcome to all my new subscribers. Thank you to all my longtime subscribers. Sky's really the limit. Remember, guys, the most important thing, to make good decisions, make good choices, take good care of yourselves, your family, your loved ones, your fellow human beings. Try to have a great day. I'll talk to you guys soon. God bless.